Right now, 5 countries are one supply chain break away from total economic collapse, and they all depend on a single island nation most people forget exists. I'm not talking about a small dependency. I'm talking about countries that would face blackouts, food shortages, and economic meltdown within weeks if the ships stopped coming. And the most shocking part? One of these countries spends $95 billion a year on these imports, yet can barely stand to be in the same room diplomatically. If you ever wonder why global news suddenly panics over Australian trade disputes, you're about to understand exactly why. But wait, before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment, "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. According to the 2023 World Bank Trade Dependency Index, 5 nations have crossed what economists call critical vulnerability thresholds with Australian exports. We're talking about Australia, a country with just 26 million people, controlling 52% of global lithium exports, 38% of seaborne iron ore, and massive shares of coal, natural gas, and wheat that entire economies run on. Picture this: the docks at Port Hedland, Western Australia. Cargo ships the length of 3 football fields, lined up like dominoes, waiting to load iron ore. Every 24 hours, enough raw material leaves that port to build 40,000 cars. And 5 countries have bet their entire futures on this continuing forever. Let's start with the least obvious one. Number 5 might surprise you. It's one of the world's richest nations, yet it's dangerously dependent. Singapore, glittering skyline, one of the highest GDPs per capita on Earth, banking hub, tech paradise, and completely, utterly reliant on Australian natural gas. Meet Wei Chun, 34 years old, logistics manager for a Singapore refining company. I spoke with industry insiders who painted a picture of what happened in 2022 during the Australian shipping strike. Wei had built his entire career on just-in-time delivery systems. Australian LNG shipments arrived like clockwork. His refineries processed them. Singapore's power grid stayed lit. Then the strike hit. For 48 hours, shipments stopped. Wei watched his company lose $12 million as refineries went idle. Worse, panic buying began. Singapore has almost zero natural resource reserves. What you don't import, you don't have. Here's the terrifying number. Singapore imports $8.2 billion annually in Australian liquefied natural gas, according to the 2024 Australian Bureau of Statistics. Without that gas, Singapore's electricity grid, 90% dependent on gas turbines, would face rolling blackouts within 72 hours. Think about that. One of the world's most advanced nations, brought to its knees by a supply chain hiccup 4,000 kilometers away. Close your eyes and imagine Singapore at night. All those lights, all that air conditioning in the tropical heat, all those data centers running the financial world. Every bit of it runs on gas that comes from Australian waters. Wei now advocates for diversified supply chains. Singapore is investing $4.7 billion in solar infrastructure by 2030. But right now, today, they're completely dependent. And here's the thing. Singapore is just the appetizer. This next country's dependence is literally carved into their buildings. Number 4 built their entire modern empire on one Australian export, and they have zero backup plan. South Korea, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, BTS, 5th largest exporter in the world. All of it, built on a foundation of Australian iron, ore, and coal. According to the 2023 Korea Institute for Industrial Economics, South Korea imports 43% of its steel-making materials from Australia. That's over $15 billion worth annually. Let me introduce you to Park Min-jae, 52, supply chain director at Hyundai, 28 years in the automotive industry. Park witnessed something in 2020 that still keeps him up at night. Iron ore prices spiked. Australian miners raised prices. 3 Korean steel mills nearly went bankrupt. The government had to step in with emergency loans. Park told colleagues, "I realize the entire Korean automotive industry depended on mines 8,000 kilometers away, owned by companies we have zero control over. Every shipment delay meant 15,000 Hyundai workers sitting idle. Assembly lines frozen. Dealerships running out of inventory. Picture the Pohang Steelworks, South Korea's industrial heart. Massive blast furnaces glowing orange, turning Australian ore into the steel that becomes your car, your appliance, your phone. Now imagine those furnaces cold, silent, the cranes frozen like metal skeletons. Without Australian steel inputs, the 2024 Bank of Korea estimates South Korea's construction sector, 18% of GDP, would contract by 34%. But it's not just construction. Even South Korea's tech giants need Australian rare earth minerals for semiconductors, battery production, advanced electronics. Samsung's futuristic factories, Australian lithium in the batteries, Australian rare earths in the circuits. South Korea is now investing $23 billion in Indonesian mining partnerships, trying to build alternatives. But new mines take a decade to develop. Right now, if Australian exports stop, South Korea would have roughly 90 days of strategic reserves before their entire industrial base started shutting down. Park Min-jae now pushes for larger stockpiles. But storage is expensive, and every day of inventory sitting and used is money evaporating. But here's where it gets geopolitical. The next country's dependence has military implications. Number 3 will genuinely disturb you. This country's entire energy security hangs by a thread, and that thread runs through Australian waters. March 11, 2011, the Fukushima nuclear disaster. In one afternoon, Japan's energy strategy collapsed. They shut down nuclear plants across the country. 54 reactors went offline. Japan became 94% dependent on imported energy overnight, and they replaced nuclear power with Australian coal and liquefied natural gas. Meet Tanaka Hiroshi, 61, retired energy advisor, who worked in Tokyo during the crisis. We traded one vulnerability for another. Tanaka told industry colleagues, "We thought nuclear was dangerous, so we bet everything on fossil fuel imports instead." Here's a shocking number. Japan imports 62% of its coal from Australia. That's $18.4 billion annually, according to the 2024 Japan External Trade Organization. But coal is just the beginning. Japan also imports massive quantities of Australian LNG to power their gas turbines. A 2023 Tokyo University energy security study ran a nightmare scenario. What if Australian exports stopped? Their conclusion, Japan's electricity system would have 96 hours, for days, before widespread blackouts began. Think about Tokyo at night, that entire glowing cityscape you see in every movie. 24 million people. All those lights, all those trains, all those factories. Every bit of it powered by Australian mines. The emotional weight is crushing. Elderly Japanese citizens on fixed incomes already struggle with energy costs. A supply disruption wouldn't just be an economic problem. It would be a humanitarian crisis. And here's the geopolitical nightmare. China and Australia have ongoing trade disputes. Tensions flare regularly. When they do, Japan holds its breath. Because if Australia and China's relationship completely collapses, Japan gets caught in the crossfire. Japan is trying to escape this trap. Their $150 billion green transformation plan aims for 50% renewable energy by 2040. But that's 15 years away. Right now, today, Japan is one Australian policy decision away from the dark. Tanaka Hiroshi stays in touch with current energy officials. He told them, "We need backup plans for our backup plans." But he knows the truth. There is no backup plan at this scale. Yet even Japan's dependence pales compared to what's happening in the next country, where one Australian export literally determines if people eat or starve. Number 2 is a ticking time bomb. 280 million people. One critical import. And Australia controls the tap. Indonesia is the world's 4th most populous country, and they cannot feed themselves without Australian wheat. Dwi Kusuma, 38, third-generation wheat importer in Jakarta. Her family business has imported Australian wheat for 40 years. February 2022. Russia invades Ukraine. Global wheat prices triple overnight. Panic spreads through commodity markets. Dewey's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Bakery owners. noodle manufacturers, biscuit factories, all of them desperate. Should I shut down or raise prices 300%? They asked her. Indonesia imports 4.7 million tons of Australian wheat annually, 28% of total consumption, according to the 2024 Indonesian Ministry of Agriculture. But here's the terrifying part. Indonesia can only produce 60% of its own wheat needs. Their population grows by 3.2 million people every year. Do the math. Every year. Indonesia needs more imported wheat just to maintain current consumption levels. Picture an Indonesian morning. Millions of people eating breakfast, bread, noodles, biscuits, mie goreng, bakso. None of it possible without Australian wheat arriving at Jakarta port every single week. A 2023 University of Sydney study found Indonesian food security is 73% dependent on Australian agricultural exports when you include wheat, cattle, and dairy. This isn't just about economics. This is about political stability. Food inflation has historically triggered protests, riots, and regime changes in Indonesia. The government knows this. That's why wheat imports are a national security issue. Dewey managed to secure emergency shipments in 2022. Crisis averted. But she told her industry contacts, we're one bad harvest or shipping strike away from disaster. Indonesia is investing $8.9 billion in domestic wheat production. The problem? Indonesia's tropical climate isn't ideal for wheat. Suitable land is limited. Stand at Tanjung Priok Port in Jakarta. Watch the massive Australian grain ships arrive, one after another, like clockwork. Those ships are keeping 280 million people fed. Dewey now advocates for strategic grain reserves. Indonesia is building storage facilities to stockpile 3 months of emergency wheat. But storage is expensive. Wheat degrades. And 3 months isn't much buffer when you're feeding the 4th largest population on Earth. But nothing compares to number 1. This country's entire economic model would implode within weeks, and the global consequences would be catastrophic. Number 1 isn't just shocking, it's the most dangerous economic relationship on Earth, and most people have no idea it exists. China imports $95.7 billion worth of Australian goods every year. Read that again. $95.7 billion. Making Australia China's 5th largest trading partner, according to the 2024 Australian Department of Foreign Affairs. But here's what makes this absolutely insane. Australia and China can barely stand each other diplomatically. Trade sanctions, political tensions, military posturing, public insults. And yet, economically, they're married. The numbers are staggering. 67% of Australia's iron ore exports go to China. That's $63 billion worth. China produces 1 billion tons of steel per year. They need Australian iron ore to do it. Without it, construction halts. Manufacturing collapses. Infrastructure projects stop. Meet Li Wei, 45, steel mill manager in Tangshan, China's steel capital. Li manages a mill that produces enough steel for 2,000 buildings per year. High-rises, bridges, factories. All of it starts as Australian iron ore in its blast furnaces. In 2020, Australia imposed trade sanctions on Chinese barley and wine, retaliation for political disputes. Li watched Chinese government officials panic. They visited his mill, asked if China could replace Australian iron ore with alternatives. His answer, no, there isn't enough quality iron ore elsewhere. Not at this scale, not at this purity. 200,000 jobs in my city depend on Australian ore arriving on schedule, Li told colleagues. Brazil has iron ore, but Brazilian mines can't scale fast enough. Different quality, different logistics chains. Russia has iron ore, but it's lower grade, requires different processing. China is stuck, completely dependent on a country they're in a Cold War with. Here's the nightmare scenario, modeled by Oxford Economics in 2023. If Australia cut iron ore exports, Chinese construction, which represents 30% of China's GDP, would contract by over $400 billion. Unemployment would spike. Economic growth would collapse. And here's where it gets global. China is the world's factory. Your phone, your laptop, your car, probably made in China. If China's economy implodes, worldwide recession follows. Your retirement account evaporates. Your job becomes less secure. Picture Port Hedland, Australia, the world's largest bulk export port, operating 24/7. Massive or carriers line up like ants. Every hour, enough iron or leaves at port to build a skyscraper. And 67% of it goes to one country that Australia is politically opposed to. The paradox is mind-bending. Two countries that barely speak diplomatically, yet economically inseparable. Leeway checks shipping schedules every morning. My whole world depends on those Australian ships arriving, he says. China is trying to develop alternative sources. Mines in Guinea, project in Africa. But that's 8 to 10 years away. Minimum. Right now, today, China's entire industrial machine runs on Australian ore. And both countries know it. Zoom out. Look at a map of global trade routes. All roads lead to Australia. Here's the uncomfortable truth Western democracies don't want to admit. We criticize China constantly. Human rights, authoritarianism, aggression. But Australia, a Western democracy and close U.S. ally, literally fuels Chinese industry. Australia's economy depends on Chinese money. $95.7 billion annually. But Australia is politically and militarily aligned with the United States. So what happens when you can't choose between your biggest customer and your closest ally? We're watching that tension play out in real time. If you're watching from the US, UK, or EU, your economy depends on Chinese manufacturing, which depends on Australian exports. You're connected whether you like it or not. When Australian iron ore prices spike, your construction costs rise. When Australian wheat gets redirected, your bread gets more expensive. When Australian lithium production slows, your electric vehicle costs more. This isn't theoretical. This is your life, affected by supply chains you never think about. So what happens next? Countries are diversifying, but slowly. Building new mines takes 7 to 15 years. New ports, new rail lines, new refineries. The 2024 International Energy Agency report warns critical mineral supply chains remain dangerously concentrated in single regions. Some solutions are emerging. Japan is leading rare earth recycling initiatives, extracting valuable minerals from old electronics instead of mining new ones. South Korea is building 6-month strategic reserves of key materials, expensive but provide security. Indonesia is negotiating wheat agreements with India and Canada, reducing dependence on Australia. China is investing billions in African mines, but those won't produce at scale for another decade. Meanwhile, Australia is considering its leverage. Should they diversify their customer base, reduce dependence on China, or use their monopoly position for geopolitical influence? These aren't easy questions, and the gap between current dependency and future alternatives remains enormous. Quick reality check. Singapore's solar plan, 2030 target, 6 years away. South Korea's Indonesian mines, 2033 earliest production. Japan's renewable transition, 2040 goal, 15 years away. China's African alternatives, 2032 to 2035 timeline. A lot can go wrong in 6 to 15 years. Here's what I want to know. If you were leading one of these countries, would you risk everything on one supplier, or would you pay more for security? And here's the real question nobody wants to answer. Is Australia using this leverage responsibly? Or are we watching economic blackmail in slow motion? Drop your country below and tell me, how dependent is your nation on imports you never think about? Because if you think your country isn't on a list like this, you're probably wrong. I'm already researching the next video. The hidden dependencies that could collapse entire regions. The like button won't fix global supply chains, but it does tell me you want more uncomfortable truths like this. See you in the next one.